And hi, I'm Claire Kremen, faculty member in IRES, and I'm happy to welcome you to the start of our seminar series for 2025 in the spirit of the new year. Of course, we are gathered today on the traditional unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. And land acknowledgement is just the beginning of anything that we can do towards truth and reconciliation. And so my hope is that in 2025, it will be a good year for truth and reconciliation, both at UBC and also in Canada more broadly. It's my pleasure to introduce Adrian Lu. Adrian is a postdoc here in IRES, and we've known each other for a while because he was a graduate student with me at when I was back at University of California, Berkeley in ESPM. Adrian has a very interesting career trajectory. He got his law degree at Harvard University, and after that degree, he practiced law in Silicon Valley for about 5 years before he decided to go to China, where he explored environment. He worked in various NGOs and became really interested in environmental justice issues as well. And on the basis of that, that's when he applied to UC Berkeley to deepen his understanding and his knowledge in ecology. And so he carried out his PhD work in the Salinas Valley. He's going to talk about that work, but also about other work that we're working on now together that was sort of around his dissertation work that we had not previously completed. And he's here now in at IRES. One of his interests is making some additional transitions, I think, in understanding biocultural diversity. So maybe he'll talk a bit about that too. I'm not sure, but.
Thank you so much, Claire. My name is Adrian, for those of you who don't know me. It's really a pleasure to open the semester's IRES seminar. So today I'll be talking about the main project I'm working on at IRES with Claire right now. And so we're looking at ecosystem multifunctionality in strawberry growing region in California. So I'll start out with one of the primary motivations for this work, at least in my mind, kind of comes out of these global declines in biodiversity that we've been reading about over the last few decades. Probably most kind of well-known are large mammals and amphibians, but arthropods and insects aren't an exception. And so yeah, there's just a lot of overwhelming evidence that across taxa of insects, we're seeing a lot of decreases in both abundance and richness over the last 40, 50 years. And I think at this point, it's pretty well accepted that the main driver of these decreases in biodiversity are due to human activity. And within sort of the ambit of human activity, one of the largest driver is land use, so land conversion for human uses, and the biggest one of those is agriculture for food and other agricultural products. And so yeah, these figures just show they're comparing kind of the control of primary vegetation and changes in total abundance and richness for insects. And the biggest difference, the biggest negative impact is in areas of high intensity agriculture. So where does that take us? You may have heard, oh, sorry. So just to put it in the context of land area, so about 76% of Earth's land surface is habitable. And out of that, almost half of it humans have converted for our own agricultural use. And so, yeah, it's just a really, really large scale use of the planet for our species. So you may have heard that there's this 30 by 30 initiative, kind of a worldwide drive to have different governments around the world commit to protecting 30% of their land area for conservation by the year 2030. And usually when we talk about conservation land, it's in the form of national parks and protected areas and things like that. But another really important and kind of potentially impactful area for conserving land is within working lands, which are mostly agricultural lands that are producing products for human use. And so a couple of papers that have come out in the last 4 or 5 years also kind of recommending this rule of thumb of having at least 20% of working landscapes be covered by native habitat as well. So this is one from 2020 and then a more recent one. So when we're talking about this rule of thumb protecting this 20% or so, that is kind of the minimum amount required to sustainably preserve what biodiversity we have left, and also in turn continue to provide the nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services that that biodiversity provides. So these are kind of large-scale global targets for conservation, but really important is sort of the more nuanced, place-based, context-based work that can show regional planners and farmers how to implement practices and policies that might get us closer to these goals. So one of the projects that Claire led is what we called colloquially the Salinas Strawberry Project, funded by USDA. And one of the goals of the project, so my work kind of focuses on the center part of this, where we were looking at how gradients and ecological diversification at different scales, at both the landscape and the local scale, how those gradients impacted biodiversity, and then how that in turn impacted an array of ecosystem services, including pollination, pest control, soil quality, and greenhouse gas emissions. So out of this project, we have started publishing some articles. Most of these are based on one or perhaps two ecosystem service indicators. So one of the earlier ones was bird services and disservices in this study system. So we're looking at birds as pest control providers, but also as pests themselves, and then bird diversity. This one recently came out looking at natural enemies and how natural enemy communities affected crop loss in strawberries. This one was about arthropod communities, so pest and natural enemy communities' effect on levels of pest control. And then there's one under review about greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so each of these kind of focuses on a single ecosystem service. But because we measured so many ecosystem services in this project, there's a not more interesting, but kind of an overarching question also about how the ecosystem services are simultaneously provided in this landscape. And one way to study that is through something called multifunctionality analysis. So a really simple definition of multifunctionality is just an ecosystem's ability to provide multiple ecosystem functions or ecosystem services simultaneously. All right, so to help kind of visualize multifunctionality, one important aspect of multifunctionality is looking at the individual ecosystem services that are provided and seeing if there are any trade-offs or synergies between all of those. So one way that researchers do this is through these radar diagrams or spiderweb diagrams. So these are just kind of idealized examples. I don't think they're based on real data. But for example, given a monoculture row crop system, you can see that crops are provided at quite a high level, but everything else is pretty low. And then you have sort of this idealized kind of diversified agriculture system where a lot of these 7 or 8 are provided at quite high levels. And so there's a lot of work to be, theoretically, it's possible to kind of try to optimize things so that they look more like this than like this. But of course, these situations are very context dependent. And a lot of work needs to be done to try to figure out how landscapes and farms can be designed to optimize or maximize a large number of ecosystem services. So another way to visualize multifunctionality is just kind of is by these pairwise correlations. So in this study, they were comparing organic to IPM orchards, and this one's both types of orchards combined. And just as an example, I guess to no one's surprise, yield and income are highly correlated in all 3 groups. And then, unfortunately for people who care about biodiversity, biodiversity and yield were negatively correlated in all 3. And so, yeah, this is it's another way to kind of visualize which ecosystem services work together or work against, not work together, but how they're negatively and positively correlated with each other, given a certain set of circumstances. So then beyond looking at the kind of comparing ecosystem services with each other, another way to look at multifunctionality is to look at a single number. So when we looked at the definition of multifunctionality, an ecosystem's capacity or ability to simultaneously provide ecosystem services, we're talking about, can we put a single number onto this landscape or this ecosystem to sort of compare it against other ones or compare it against other circumstances. And so ways that researchers have tried to quantify this single multifunctionality index are the averaging method. So that just involves taking each of your ecosystem function indicators and standardizing them, and then averaging them and reporting that value. The threshold method, which is a count of the number of thresholds that are met. And so this is somewhat subjective in that it requires the researchers to kind of use their expert opinion to set thresholds for each of the ecosystem services. And then some researchers also will do kind of a more objective way of perhaps looking at the average of the top 10% of the values for each of the ecosystem functions and setting that as a threshold. And then a more recently proposed way to look at this is the Hill number method, which is kind of analogous to Shannon diversity in that it takes account of both the number of thresholds met and also the evenness of the performance for each of the ecosystem services. So this is just an example of kind of a side-by-side of the cobweb graph, the spiderweb graph that shows each of the ecosystem services in relation to the others. And then on the right here is a representation of an averaged multifunctionality index versus species richness. So the questions for this project are kind of at the top is how can landscapes and farms be designed to promote multifunctionality profiles desired by stakeholders? The reason I put designed in quotes is that there are very few situations when people are able to completely design, but this is sort of providing estimates and providing showing patterns and correlations so that we have some information about in the times when we do have leverage points and how we can possibly change things at a landscape or a farm scale, how those can be changed to optimize or to get the best result possible within the limitations. And so kind of related to that is there are a lot of cases when, particularly from a farmer's perspective, it's nearly impossible to make changes to the landscape. Farmers and farm managers at best have control over the farm or the area that they're managing. And so an important question for them is, given a particular landscape context, can farm level interventions, management decisions, compensate for example, like a simplified landscape? And then we also want to know the direct and indirect relationships between habitat complexity, biodiversity, and these different ecosystem services. And then finally, what are the trade-offs and synergies among the different ecosystem services that we care about? So a little bit more about the study system. So we worked on 37 sites in these 2 counties on the central coast of California, and all of them were organically managed strawberry fields. And they were in this kind of shaded area just around Monterey Bay, and then down here is the Salinas Valley. So you may have heard of this phrase, the salad bowl of the world. In literature, I think Steinbeck kind of started this idea with the just amount of productivity and farming that happens in the Salinas Valley. And so, in addition to leafy greens, lettuce, and vegetables, this area is also an extremely important region for U.S. strawberry production. So California produces 88% of U.S. strawberries, and this region produces half of California's strawberry production. And also, probably not surprising, this area, so I'll point out, so this is the Monterey Bay, is also a biodiversity hotspot. And along with the farming, it's a pesticide hotspot as well. So that makes it a really interesting and important region for studying these questions. So when we're talking about local versus landscape scales, what do we mean? So local, like I mentioned, is kind of what can be controlled by a farmer or a farm manager. And on one side of the spectrum are diversified farms that have lots of different crops. They use crop rotation. They might have some non-crop vegetation as well. Specialized are these monoculture row crops that are generally machine and input intensive. And then on the landscape scale, we're looking at on the order of kilometers generally. Regional management and examples of kind of aspects of landscape management might be protected areas, water bodies, or regional monoculture. So, for example, this example here is locally extremely specialized, but it's surrounded by what looks to be a forested area. So on the landscape scale, it's complex. For our study, the landscape composition that we looked at was these 2 types of semi-natural habitat, woodland and grassland. So the woodlands here tended to be native pine and oak woodlands, and also some chaparral. So yeah, perennial, woody, native plants. And then the grassland is more semi than natural. Most of it is, it's mostly unmanaged, but it's also mostly invaded by exotic grasses and flowering plants. This example here is a type of mustard that's a favorite host for one of the really important strawberry pests. And then on the local scale, this farm is a teaching farm run by an NGO in the region. And each of the colors represents a different type of crop. So this is an example of an extremely diversified, locally diversified farm that then is surrounded by all of this other monoculture. And so we collected data at each of the farms on several different measures of crop diversity, including rotation, and then just area crop diversity and perennial crop structure. And then we also looked at non-crop diversity, such as hedgerows, flower strips, wind blocks, water features. Another aspect of local scale plant diversity is just kind of the unmanaged plants, both weeds and native plants that are, we looked at 3 different transects for each farm in the field, and then outside edge and inside edge. So it's not management per se, but it does reflect kind of weed management and just the kind of the local level plant diversity for each farm. Okay, so what I've just finished talking about were sort of the environmental variables on both landscape and local scale. And we were interested in how those affect biodiversity, right? So the biodiversity indicators that we'll use in this multifunctionality analysis are birds, pollinators, and natural enemies. And then the ecosystem services that we've collected data for: pest control, soil quality, crop loss, pollination. Along with pollination, we do have some measures of crop quality, including like berry mass and sugar content. So it's possible that we could also create an index of crop quality as well. So for the statistical analysis, primarily will be generalized linear mixed models, and then piecewise structural equation models to get at the direct and indirect effects. So we hypothesize that the environmental variables will have direct effects on biodiversity, which will then have direct effects on the different ecosystem services, but that there could also be, there could also be direct effects of the environmental factors on the ecosystem services due to things that we didn't study or collect data about. And if we do find those, then that'll open up questions for further research. So I am currently in the middle of wrangling the data and initial analyses. I don't have results to report to you today, but I'm hoping that that gives you a good picture of the Salinas Strawberry Project in general and my goals for this project. Thank you very much. All right, I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah, Evan? Yeah. Right. Well, so what? Oh, yes. So the question, just to repeat the question, is about the Hill number and its limitations. So Hill number is a single number that represents the multifunctionality of a landscape or an ecosystem. But there are lots of situations when managers or other people, they care about the different ecosystem services on their own, or there will be different stakeholders that value certain ecosystem services above others. And in that case, maybe the single index wouldn't be so useful. Yeah, thank you for the question. So from what I understand, most multifunctionality papers, they'll do both, right? So they'll have they'll do an analysis that's represented by something like the spider web graph or the pairwise correlation, and then they'll also report not necessarily the Hill number, but maybe the average number or the threshold number. And the other thing that can be done is they can calculate different multifunctionality numbers based on different weightings for the different ecosystem services. And so what I've seen some authors do is they'll talk to stakeholders, or they'll kind of imagine hypothetical stakeholders who maybe there's like the farmer, the conventional farmer whose values crop production above everything else. And then, so they'll calculate kind of the multifunctionality index for that set of stakeholders versus the maybe like a local conservation NGO who wants a more kind of balanced approach for provision of the different services, and then they'll calculate it for that set of values. So yeah, that's one way that. But I agree with you that just reporting a single index without looking at the different ecosystem functions and without providing indices in different contexts wouldn't be so useful. Chloe? Yeah. Yeah, so the way that this is going to work in my mind is that we're going to do a different structural equation model for each ecosystem service. And for each of the ecosystem services, we'll have to think about which types of biodiversity and which environmental factors are likely to have an effect on them. And so for each ecosystem service, like that answer will be different. So like, yeah, I guess not to not get into too detailed of an answer. Since we'll be doing different models for each ecosystem service, I think that'll provide a lot of opportunities for us to discover both positive and negative correlations. Oh, I didn't repeat the question. Did David still have a question? Okay. So. Okay, so the question is, in light of the like really current news about the wildfires in LA, how does the specter of climate change impact or inform this research? Yeah, so there are definitely aspects of climate change that we've explored in the papers that we've done already. One of them was to look at, for example, earlier onset of, so this is a Mediterranean climate, and there's like a yearly dry season or drought season. And what we've noticed in this region is that the drought season has been getting longer and it's occurring earlier. And so just to give one example, the strawberry pests are actually native to California, and strawberries are also native to California, but not at the scale that they're grown now. And so when, generally speaking, the pests kind of overwinter in these unmanaged grasslands, and then during the rainy season, those grasslands provide a lot of resources for them. But as soon as they start drying out, those resources go away, and we have hypothesized that those pests move into the agriculture because there's like constant irrigation, and so with climate change, as the onset of drought gets earlier in the year and as the drought season gets longer, it's very plausible that plus pressure will start earlier in the season, which makes it even harder for natural enemies to colonize and effectively control. And so, yeah, that's just one example of how climate change might be affecting the system. Thanks. Kate? Okay, so a question through the chat, if we've seen correlations between diversification and profitability. So specifically, I have not looked at profitability. And so in this case, I don't have an answer for that. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so the question is sort of based on these other findings that there's a negative correlation between biodiversity and profitability. Do I see kind of openings or possibilities for farmers to be incentivized to care more about biodiversity? Is that a fair? Okay, but the system in general, yeah, not just farmers. Yeah. So I think that just I think it's more of a, I'm not an expert in policy or incentives and economic incentives, but just from my personal opinion, I guess, is that I think that a lot of these things kind of have to be done at a higher level, at a policy level, to internalize the externalities that are not accounted for right now, including runoff of nitrates and pests and toxins. Somehow this is I'm thinking a little bit about. There's also kind of like ingrained cultural practices that people really stick to without great evidence that they work. And this is sort of like in the negative of what you were answering, but it's also what you're asking is also related to Kate's question that I just thought of. But one example is tractor vacuuming. So especially for organic strawberry growers, because they're limited in the pesticides that they can use, it's this widespread belief that one of the most effective ways they can control pests is driving these tractor mounted vacuums over the crops. And it's just literally these huge fans that suck everything loose off of the foliage, and, just turns it into dust and then it flies out the top, right? But these things, they're very labor intensive, they're fuel intensive, the equipment is expensive, and they're very indiscriminate, right? Like the pollinators and natural enemies get sucked up at similar rates as the pests do. But it's just anecdotally, it's difficult to, and what we've found in a couple of the papers is that there's no conclusive evidence that this practice actually helps reduce either pest numbers or crop loss. But it's kind of an uphill climb to convince farmers to change their behavior despite the high costs of doing this, because in their minds, this is the only most effective thing that they can do. So yeah, things like that also can make it difficult to make change. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, again, on a follow-up to Chloe's question about the correlation between biodiversity and profit, but kind of looking more at a more nuanced look of the different types of natural habitat. So if we're looking at forest and grasslands, for example, is there one that, I mean, they're both aspects of landscape diversity, right? But they have different effects because they have different ecological effects. Yeah, great question. That's exactly why we separated those two, because there are a lot of studies that kind of just count semi-natural habitat, all of it, without looking at the ecological differences. And yeah, we hypothesized, and this was borne out in the results as well, that generally speaking, the native forests provided habitat for natural enemies, while the unmanaged grasslands were providing more resources for the pests. And so in both for the pests, in terms of pest numbers and crop loss, there was a positive correlation between the amount of grassland and those things, but not for the native forests. All right, looks like, do we have time for one more question? Okay, yeah, last question. Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so the question was about the point that the possibility that local diversification might be able to compensate for simple landscapes. And is there something in the study design or the analysis that might be able to get at that question? And yeah, so one of the at the outset, one of the goals of this Salinas project was related to this exact question. And so when the sites were selected, they were selected along independent gradients of landscape and local complexity. And so, yeah, we selected sites so that landscape and local complexity for each particular farm would not be correlated. And so in this way, when we do the analysis, we can interact them. And in that way, see if there are values of landscape complexity at which local diversification might have greatest effect. And so actually in the most recent paper, we did detect an effect of, detect an effect where local diversification had the greatest effect on crop loss at an intermediate level of landscape complexity, like 25% native forest, if I recall correctly, which was a nice result because it dovetails well with the goal of having 20 to 25% minimum natural habitat in working landscapes. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.